Matt. And thanks, everybody. I feel like there's a lot of people who are very invested in this discussion today. There's a lot of different ideas and experiences in the room. And it's a really confusing topic, I think. So hopefully we can get to some clarity through the discussion. So neurodiversity, at one level, is a statement of fact that flies in the face of neoliberal ideology and the enforcement of human standardization. At its best, neurodiversity is a statement that our brains are not actually made to standard. We are essentially biologically diverse. We are not physically or mentally formed in precisely the same way as if out of a production line. And there is no teleological outcome to human evolution. We are not meant to be neurologically wired a certain way, and nor is there any inherent superiority of one biological form over any other. This truth, that the best of broad neurodiversity politics elevates, flies in the face of the objectification of human labour power that characterises capitalism. Children are, from birth, measured against standards of physical and developmental growth on charts. We're shaped and measured to achieve the ultimate form in education, in public health, in advertising, and the ultimate confirmation of standardisation and its source is the standardisation in the labour market, where our labour power is bought and sold as interchangeable units on different increments on productivity hierarchies that bosses, our rulers, judge to either work to standard or fail to work to standard. The explicit pseudoscientific standards that have been developed to measure and weigh our normality and our type, from growth charts, BMI, intelligence tests, inform cultural norms and attitudes that are almost always racist, almost always sexist, and harmful to both the people who fit on them and the people who don't. Neurodiversity suggests that this measure, weigh, and compare to standard world is neither natural or necessity, and that as long as we live under this dynamic, we cannot capture the truth and possibilities of our individual specific uniqueness or the possibilities of the fact of our diverging from the standard. This part of, I guess, the statement of fact of neurodiversity, Marxists are in agreement with. In fact, it's core Marxist business to rail against every ideological and economic effort to reduce our senses of selves to what our rulers would have us believe we are worth. It's core Marxist business to reject the very idea of a fixed and unchanging standard of human nature. And Marx argued that for all the focus on the individual under capitalism, we cannot give our specificity, our individuality, full expression under capitalism. And the aim of socialism is the emancipation of human beings and the creation of social conditions for the development of individual personality. But beyond this statement of fact, many of us would have encountered over the last decades neurodiversity politics that has developed as an influential liberal political framework that is used to challenge stigma and social exclusion of people whose behaviour or mannerisms or cognitive patterns may diverge from what's seen as the typical, as well as people who have cognitive impairments and disability. Neurodiversity itself refers to the whole human population, but many people now embrace an individual identity of neurodivergence, that is, diverging from the typical, potentially with diagnoses and identities such as autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, no diagnosis, or neurospicy. Solidarity argues against the stigma and is 100% with the destigmatisation and misinformation from people like RFK, who articulate a really degrading idea that autistic people who are neurodivergent, people who are autistic are lesser than because of their failure to be able to pay taxes. And we are relentlessly against the heinous pressures that force people to fight for funding and support that they deserve. But I will argue that the dominant neurodiversity politics do not give us adequate tools to fight for the right for people to live and flourish outside the standard. And they give us inadequate ideas to even survive the oppressive bourgeois standards, and they're definitely inadequate for destroying them. I'm going to argue that there is a reductionism in dominant neurodiversity politics that, because it starts with individual brains, can lead us back into the essentialised, deficit-based, norms-based, medicalised and individualised approach to human difference and disability, and reduces the focus that we need on understanding and transforming the increasingly oppressive and disabling social relations that we need. There are rich ideas in the Marxist tradition, including those of revolutionary disability educator and psychologist Lev Vygotsky, and in all of our tradition of fighting oppression that we need for transforming the education system, the health system, the NDIS, and ultimately capitalism, so that we have a society where individuals can really radically be themselves together. To start with, I just want to talk about the question of how big our brain-based differences really are. There is a contradiction inherent in neurodiversity politics. On the one hand, the critique of the idea that there are any essential deficit in having different than typical traits, for example, sensory preferences, communication preferences, learning styles, or patterns of attentiveness. And yet much of the advocacy for neurodivergent recognition and rights rests on two assumptions. Firstly, that there is actually a typical set of human behaviours from which some individuals fundamentally diverge, and that needs to be recognised and accounted for. And secondly, that the differences are fundamentally explained by differences in an individual's brain or their wiring, that is, the neuro in neurodiversity. These two assumptions lead, however uncomfortably for many individuals, to diagnostic criteria and psychometric testing as the key to decoding an individual's problem with being different. I want to acknowledge that many people turn to diagnosis with a huge dose of scepticism about the validity of the diagnosis, and they hold a very pragmatic attitude to it, but desperation about needing one, and we'll come back to why people need one or may feel like they need one, drives them to it. But I would say that there is nowhere near the kind of scepticism about the validity of the diagnostic process in neurodiversity politics that would encourage people to hold their diagnoses at least lightly, and acknowledge it. There's not enough of an acknowledgement that the flaws in the test, like the process of getting tested, is extremely flawed. The idea that diagnostic categories like ASD, ADHD, OCD are fixed and firm neurokines or brain structures or wirings or have biological underpinnings is peddled by influential pop culture, hunted for confirmation by scientists, implied by many of the diagnostic and statistical manuals, particularly previous versions of it, taken for granted by teachers, health practitioners, influencers, but it's absolutely not grounded in evidence. Despite the efforts of well-funded neuroscientists and ideologues, there is no evidence that people can be divided into neurologically distinct groups based on psychiatric diagnosis. For example, a large 2019 study comparing brain scans and results of psychometric tests and behavioural diagnoses was just the latest that could not find evidence that existing diagnostic categories of OCD, ASD and ADHD are associated with unique patterns of difference in brain structure. They found that ASD-like behaviour traits and to some extent inattention traits picked up on a battery of psychometric tests were found across a continuum of people diagnosed with ADHD and ASD and OCD and so-called typical development. They agreed with other studies that could not find evidence of the existing criteria represent distinct underlying mechanisms of dysfunction or predict treatment response. There are no biomarkers, that is, blood or brain tests for dyslexia and other learning difficulties and disorders, and behavioural geneticists are finding that genetic differences are a matter of many different genetic variations, all of which have a tiny effect and which are present throughout the whole population. These findings suggest that we will never be able to diagnose types of neurodivergence based on brain scan because the diagnostic categories do not reliably map onto neurological difference. As it stands, psychometric tests, not brain scans, are used to diagnose and allocate funding. They are supposedly a standard and scientific method used to measure individuals' mental capabilities and behavioural style. Just want to show, we have a very strong and ardent critique and tradition of critiquing psychometric tests. And I want to show some examples of assessment items or questions on tests that are used in the Victorian education system to determine diagnoses and to determine the funding level that individuals will get in school. So this is like the gateway to resources and the gateway to being understood as neurodivergent in Victorian public education. This is the NICHQ for ADHD, and it honestly breaks my heart. So teachers, parents, and an assessor are given criteria like this. This is just one part of it. And you can see that the items that you're supposed to rank individual children on, they're completely subjective. They are completely deficit-based. There is, I suppose, no element or no suggestion in this that these traits could be determined by emotional factors, social factors, or anything else other than an implied existing neurotype. So things like loses things necessary for tasks or activities, is easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, is forgetful in daily activities, fidgets, leaves seat in classroom, runs about, climbs excessively, is on the go or often acts as if driven by a motor. I always find that one funny because it's like it's quoting from something, but what? Driven by what? I don't know. Talks excessively. What is excessive talking? And so these are measured. They're kind of compared with each other. The results are added up, and it's decided whether you will get the funding for ADHD or whether you will be considered having a diagnosis, and it's used as part of your diagnosis. This is used for level 3 funding in Victoria for people with autism spectrum disorder. It's just one item of it. The part that I find particularly dehumanising, I guess, is overly needy or dependent, is extremely anxious or nervous, cries or is sad for no clear reason, avoids interacting with others, lacks energy, is extremely fearful, is extremely shy, is very irritable or moody, complains of feeling sick, has temper tantrums, is disobedient. I think a few things that should jump out as obvious is how subjective, how culturally bound, how deficit-based, how profoundly unrevealing these are. They are completely descriptive, and each element could be caused by any constellation of social, emotional, neurological, interpersonal, or educational reasons. They are static condemnations, and I always feel this really strongly when I'm asked to assess a child like this. I'm asked to condemn them to these criteria. They reveal nothing about under what circumstances any of these or any other elements are changing and how they could be drawn out. The informants, so parents and teachers are called informants by the assessors, and there are lots of measures that are taken against the possibility that they could be lying or biased. And so there's this assumption of kind of unreliability of everybody involved except for the assessor, and I'll get to who that is in Victoria in a moment. This is what's spat out at the end of one of the tests and given to teachers to work with. That's the ASD one. Adaptive behaviour is composite, provides an overall summary measure, it's a sample one, of Jordan's adaptive functioning. His standard score is 66 with a 90% confidence interval of 61 to 71. His rank of 1 means that his score was greater than 1% of individuals in Jordan's age group. What are you supposed to do with this? What does it mean to a teacher in a classroom that the confidence interval of 58 to 72 and the percentile rank of 1, what does that mean for whether they're interested in reading or not? What does it mean for how they're getting on with the other students in the class, how they feel about being in school, what their interests are, how engaged, like any spectrum of questions. None of those questions about learning are actually showing up on these tests or the results. And these are as old as time, as old as capitalism, I should say, not as old as time. If there is funding, it's often kind of focused then on the things that are then showing up in the test. So like, one of the things is, can they cut with scissors? And then there's a lot of focus then on like learning to cut with scissors. It's not treated as a symptom, it's treated as, ultimately the cause then is that they can't cut with scissors. So, that becomes a kind of indomitable focus rather than, engaging in a human way about what needs to be learned. Lev Vygotsky, the socialist psychologist and disability educator that I mentioned, wrote about psychometric tests. The object of the consultation was this is an anecdote, he says, the object of the consultation was an unmanageable boy of 8 just starting school. According to his mother, the child had strong and unmotivated fits of temper, passion, wrath and anger. In such a state, he could be dangerous to those around him. He might throw a stone at another child or attack someone with a knife. After investigation, we recalled the mother to convey the results. Your child, said the psychiatrist, is epileptoid. The boy's mother became attentive and started to listen closely. What does that mean? She asked. It means, the psychiatrist told her, that the boy is irritable, wrathful and temperamental. It means that when angry he forgets himself and can be dangerous to those around him. Disillusioned, the mother exclaimed, but I could have told you this myself. The psychometric and diagnostic tests sit at odds with the fundamental aims of neurodiversity, to destigmatise, to dismantle normative hierarchies, and so to square the circle of this, some people will reject formal diagnosis but claim the identity. But it also trends in the opposite direction, where because the diagnosis is a socially recognised licence and validation for different behaviour, for resources and support, people will push to have a psychometric test and diagnosis developed for the specific constellation of behaviours that they are observing and feeling, and not getting adequate attention for. So, for example, people would have heard of pathological demand avoidance, which is, people are pushing to become its own diagnostic criteria. Dyslexia is another one where parents have pushed for more testing in schools because lots of students, they say, have fallen through the cracks because there wasn't enough testing, there wasn't enough diagnostic criteria of this variety. But the identities and conditions are social constructs, literally constructed in secret with non-disclosure agreements by medical institutions like the American Psychiatric Association, who creates the DSM. The companies that create and administer the screening assessment tools are reinforced by government bodies who are doling out exemptions and allowances and funding and requiring the proof of deficit. In Victoria, the tests are administered. Many of you will know Max Employment from Centrelink. That Max, every person, every chance is the human resources juggernaut that runs the testing that is the ultimate arbiter of whether or not students get funding and resources. So there's a lot to be dubious about here that we should be far, far more dubious about. But what is driving the pursuit of a neurodivergent diagnosis? If the diagnosis is so unrevealing and unreliable, why are we pursuing these diagnoses in increasing numbers? One answer is resources and support. The NDIS model is not a universal support model where the gold standard support workers, equipment, services, housing, medical care, attention, and education and therapies are available to all. And as everybody, at some point in our lives, will have a physical or a cognitive impairment that we will need extra and specific support with. The NDIS is the opposite, where individuals need to prove and litigate for their individual specific need, to defend it over and over and over again. And this is absolutely why some people are driven to the diagnosis, because they need it to get access to unlock those supports. But the same is true in education. So, you can't get education support staff, for example, without going through some of these tests. But another really significant reason that people seek diagnosis is recognition and relief from the increasing pressure to perform in order to be recognised as a valid human being. The pressure to perform competitively as individuals is in every inch of our existence. And children, parents, within our families, at school, at work, at the gym, when you're unemployed, in social situations, on social media, it is the air that we breathe. And with the decline of union strength and power, and the decline of different ideas and values that left social movements can use to push back with, the attacks on human rights, for example, there is really such minimal escape from this relentless atomization and individualization and pressure to compete and perform. In the absence of the big social forces that challenge the hegemony of the ruling class and its degrading approach to our humanity, our fundamental ability to relax in social situations and trust that the people around you are not measuring you is so eroded. I think this social situation can really bring out traits that are on those psychometric tests And it can also make people want to get diagnoses when they want some relief from the pressures to conform. I want to take, for example, just go a bit deeper into the institution of the neoliberal education system and how this really does put so much crushing pressure on individuals. The rise of neurodiversity has come alongside the rise of the incredibly destructive testing agenda across Western countries and the aggressive neoliberal dismantling of progressive reforms in education that were won in the 60s and 70s. The pressure to perform and to prove your worth in education on narrower parameters and at younger and younger ages has been increasing markedly since 2009. NAPLAN at years 3, 5 and 9 was just the beginning. And when I first started teaching, that's the year that it came in as a very, that was it for Australia. And that was the beginning. It came with the unashamed narrowing of the curriculum to teach to tests and increasing the tests, a focus on a narrow focus of literacy and numeracy. These are the proliferation of standardised tests in primary schools in Victoria. So these now, it's not just NAPLAN, this is in primary school. There's the Inside Assessment platform that the department has created so that everybody can test as much as they want all the time. Tailored assessment tools on the website for each area of the curriculum, the English online interview for assessing English schools for Foundation, which is kindergarten for New South Wales people in Year 2, diagnostic assessment tools in English, mathematics online interview, fractions and decimals online interview, tools for enhancing assessment literacy, abilities-based learning and education support assessment tools, transition learning and development statement, intercultural capabilities assessment tools. Everything is assessed. And if it's not assessed, then it's definitely not paid attention to. Your entire focus, particularly in the early years where there is such anxiety about whether kids are able to read and whether they're performing on the measures that they should be performing on, becomes really an obsessive focus, and kids feel it. Add to these tests is the streaming within classes, between schools. That has returned, that was an anathema in education up until the early 2000s because progressive educators fought against it, but that's returned to absolute normalcy and people see that as completely normal and not segregation whatsoever. How do you account for the differences when this is what you spend all of your day doing and how you are understood by the adults in your life? It doesn't allow for granular sense of the individual, for dynamism within and between individuals, for diversity. It only accounts for performing or underperforming, and it encourages practicing for the performance. It's extremely demanding, and when children don't perform well, there are two solutions. First, double down. So we don't, there's endless articles about phonics testing in Victoria, and there was a quote from a teacher that said the other day, we don't buy into the idea of different learning styles. What matters is consistency, more discipline, more effort, more drill and skill. According to the British psychologist Naomi Fisher, the other way that the education, she says there are two ways that people have dealt with this, and one is to blame children, that they're not putting in enough effort, that they're failures, etc., that they're naughty, or that their family are not supporting their education. And the other way that the system copes with this is a quote, children who aren't thriving is to identify them as having special educational needs, a term which essentially says that they're not well suited to what the mainstream school is offering. These children often go onto waiting lists to see health professionals. She says, I've worked in one of these clinics. We assessed young people and we sent them back with a report, often a diagnosis and a list of recommendations. We never knew whether the recommendations were helpful. They aren't. But the reports were sent to the school and the children were discharged from our service. We tend to either blame them or say that there's something wrong with their brain using the medical model. After blame, the medical model comes as huge relief. It effectively says, it's not your fault, there's something wrong with your brain, you can't help it. And again, to use Victoria as an example, as soon as you decide that a child may have a disability or their family does or the child does, regardless of the diagnosis, you have to do a disability inclusion plan or an individual inclusion plan, which at the very least asks you to understand some context about the child, and suddenly, and only at this point, do their interests and motivations become salient. Unfortunately, it's just on a tick box that you pay attention to once a term, but we ask, where is it? What are your aspirations? Outline the student's strengths, interests and motivations. Put it on the 2 lines that exist for that and put it away for the rest of the year. The socialist neuroscientist Stephen Rose and sociologist Hilary Rose wrote, "Neuroscience preoccupation with the workings of the individual brain, even when the owner of that brain is engaged in intensely social interaction, and its reduction of persons to collections of neurons and synapses, is thus in accord with this focus on the individual, each neuroself responsible for their own well-being, sustained through the promise of personalised medical care." I have to skip forward for a little bit. I just want to talk about what the alternative is. The need for a social model of support that recognises that the major disabling factor is not parents, teachers or other students, although there can be agents of people's misery, particularly with bullying and exclusion, and by administering these tests and so on. That's true, but capitalism itself is what's driving this, and that's what we need to relentlessly oppose. Some people like Naomi Fisher, who I was quoting from before, advocate like homeschooling or DIY education, and there are so many people individually turning to school refusal or school can't because the education system has so utterly failed them, and it is so harmful to their humanity. But Lev Vygotsky had a different conception, and I think we need to fight for a different conception of education and a different world ultimately. He said, "We become ourselves through others. Our social circumstances matter. In the broader sense, funding, food, is the working class empowered? Is there a culture of respecting human rights?" And then in a really granular sense, he argued that we don't learn as atomised units or as passive recipients, but together in groups through modelling, observation, imitation, play, through support and guidance, and many, many different routes. For people who are interested in him, there's a lot to read. It's kind of hard sometimes to sift through the way that it's written and the different bits and pieces of articles, but there is lots of good material to inform a very different conception of education. He said, "In place of a general definition of feeble-mindedness or a learning disability, there should be an attempt, first of all, to determine how it is expressed. Secondly, to determine how the child herself attempts to cope with this phenomenon. And third, to learn which path the school must take in order to overcome the impairments afflicting the child." It's a different model altogether than psychometric tests and so on. What does it mean for our fight today? It's a fight, I think we need to be very critical of this testing regime and very critical of the reductionism that's at the heart of it, but at the same time fighting for a world where we can truly be diverse and individuals and understand that happens in social relations, and that we can't substitute for that now. What does it mean for us as individuals in struggle? I guess I just want to acknowledge that a lot of people feel like those pressures that exist in the education system also exist in struggle, and that a lot of us seek relief from each other or accommodations from each other because it feels like that dynamic is replicated, in the class struggle, in the caucus or what have you. I want to argue that it's a completely different situation, and what we're aiming for as revolutionaries and what we're aiming for in terms of our struggle with each other in educating the working class is fundamentally different, has a fundamentally different agenda. We can't substitute for the resources and the support that the ruling class should be provided. But we have to be aware that we are asking and expecting of each other to do more than what our education system and our jobs ask of us, and we have to take ourselves far more seriously than the ruling class ever does to become leaders. That means we have to acknowledge and utilise all of the strengths that we bring to the struggle, but we also have to collectively develop ways around the things that hold us back from the specific tasks that our struggle throws up, as far as we can in the circumstances that we've got, and we need to do it collectively. We need to find ways of reading or accessing the things we need to read. We need to find ways of thinking through and articulating arguments even when it feels impossible, of making lecture bashes, of understanding economics even if that's not our strength, of understanding social interactions even if that's not our strength, and dealing with our own and each other's emotions in extremely stressful and pressured situations and often devastating circumstances. This is not something that we can do if we are having a deficit approach to ourselves and having a deficit approach to each other. We do have to understand that there are social circumstances, objective circumstances that do impose incredibly strict limits on what we can do under the current social relations that we exist in. But our fight against that and our orientation to fighting against that means that it is 100% necessary that that's our focus. And if in the context of capitalism we need a diagnosis or therapies or medications or other support so that we can show up and fight and take on this struggle against the system that dehumanises us in that way, that's what we need to do. But we can't ever be degraded to the point that we accept this framework for thinking about ourselves. The contest is a fight that creates the conditions for real freedom to become full individuals together.